Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, presented by Associates for Biblical Research. I'm your host, Henry Smith. Today's episode of Digging for Truth contains some mature themes and subject matter, and so parents are encouraged to review the content first in order to determine whether the discussion is appropriate for their children. Now, it's rather self-evident that our culture in the West is really, in a way, trying to destroy itself from within, and the ultimate cause of this is idolatrous rebellion against God. And one of the foundational aspects of that rebellion is the rejection of what we call the Genesis mandates found in the early chapters of the first book of Moses. To discuss these mandates, Dr. Brian Peterson joins us for 2 episodes starting today. And we'll be drawing on his book called The Bible, Sexuality, and Culture. Brian, welcome to Digging for Truth. Great to have you on the show, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Brian. Well, welcome. We're going to be delving into your book over the course of 2 episodes. But before we do that, since this is your first time joining us on the show, and again, welcome for the first time. I really appreciate it. I'd like you to just tell us a little bit about your ministry, and if you could, your calling, and if you could include in that your intersection with the ministry of ABR, which goes back about 13 years now or so, I believe. So if you could share that, it would be great.
Sure. Well, I go back as far as my Christianity. I was brought up in a Christian home and Christian parents, and at least my mom and my grandparents. And always, worked in the church. Everything was good that way. But as a carpenter, I started as a carpenter out of high school. And when I reached about my mid-20s, I just felt God, prompted me to do more. And so over the next probably 3 or 4 years, he kind of made things a little more difficult for me in the sense of kind of the old proverbial saying, the nest got a little uncomfortable where I was. And the door opened up for me to go to Bible school when I was about 30 years old. And so I started Bible school thinking I was just going to go for, maybe a year or so. Ended up 13 years later, 4 degrees. Did my undergrad in biblical studies. Did a master's level at Peterson Divinity School in New Testament focus, but theological studies, and then an MA at Gordon Conwell in Old Testament, and then went on and did a PhD at the University of Toronto. And so it was that whole process of God bringing me along for the educational journey. And about at the end of my first degree, I knew that God was calling me to teach. But in that process, met my wife in my PhD program at the University of Toronto, and we both had a passion for archaeology. And so for us, it was, where can we go and experience archaeology before we start having children? And it worked out. We were doing some ministry in the Gambia, West Africa, back in 2010, and we went online, did some searching, and found ABR. And really, it was a God thing because we had no clue, what your organization was. We knew it was more conservative in its thinking, but it was an Old Testament dig, and I'm an Old Testament guy, and so hey, let's go and dig for Joshua's eye. And I guess the rest you could say is history, because that first year I worked with y'all, I was approached when y'all found out I had a PhD in Old Testament. I think it was Gary Byers who approached me a little while at the end of the dig or shortly thereafter and asked me to come back. And I was more than happy to come back and join the team, and worked as a square supervisor for the first couple of years, and then moved into the field archaeologist, field level archaeologist at both Makata and Shiloh. And I've been doing that since 2010 up to 2019, just before COVID. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to go back the last couple of years, but that's kind of been my journey. Teach a lot in archaeology here at the school that I teach at.
Yeah, it's great to be able to do that in the classroom for the students, and you've brought students from Lee University on our digs, and it's really been wonderful. I remember when I met you and your wife in 2010. You had been on like a 36-hour no sleep flying in, something like that. I think I recall. Yeah. And as you say, the rest is history. Now let's turn our attention now to your book. You know, you begin it with a dedication, which I'd like you to talk about. But in that dedication, you say, quote, "We are now living in a brave new world where children are regularly seen as a burden." So tell us about the dedication and the reason why you say that in your intro.
Well, I come from a family of 8, so children, for me, having a large family, my mom's family was 10 kids, and my wife is an only child. She has some step siblings. But what I have found is that in Western culture in particular, there has been a rejection of this mandate to have children, procreation. And I always tell my students, look, God's not telling you, and I'm not telling you to have 15 children. That's not the issue. But children are indeed a blessing. And my wife and I, before we got married, we discussed, if we got married, what is our family going to look like? And we decided, well, at least 3. We have 5 now and 1 on the way in September. But Western society has basically rejected that whole concept that children are a burden. That's, basically where they come from. Children are just something to be tagged on. They're an add-on to marriage, but they're not the central purpose of marriage. It's very self-centered, and that's part of our modern culture. It's very self-focused in its understanding of marriage and family. And anybody who's had children or have children know that it's very much self-sacrificing. And it takes something, your time, your effort, your money, you name it. And so for my wife and I, we have devoted ourselves to raising a family, and having not just, the 1 or 2 children, but having a large family, because the psalmist says in 127, verse 5, "Blessed is the man whose quiver is full." And there's a reason for that. Because we pass on to the next generation our values. And if we want to affect change within our culture, the way we're going to do that is through our families and the importance of having families. And my wife and I have taken that very seriously, as did my parents and their parents. And so, it's unfortunate that our culture has rejected that fundamental mandate of having children. When you stop and look at Genesis itself, and you look at the fact the patriarchs and the matriarchs, they struggled to have children. They wanted to have children.
Yes. What
was it? Rachel, I believe, "Give me children lest I die." Rachel or Rebecca. And in that particular case, literally with Rachel, she did die in childbirth, where you have, her death in the bearing of Benjamin. And so children were vitally important from a biblical perspective, and we've lost that. Yes. And again, it goes back to, I think, the fact that we've lost our understanding of what the Bible teaches on these fundamental mandates.
Well, and that's just one aspect of your book, is talking about, sort of the idea of the children being a burden or secondary. And we're going to talk about the other serious aspects and the consequences of rejecting the Genesis mandates after we return from this break.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us. Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device, or go to our website, lighthousetv.org, for more information.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here with Dr. Brian Peterson. We're talking about his book, The Bible, Sexuality, and Culture. Okay, Brian, so you take on head on in this book with boldness, but with truth and your analysis is incisive and courageous, but you when you tried to get this published with some other publishers, you ran into some obstacles. Tell us about that a little bit, because I when I read that, I thought, boy, isn't that indicative of sort of the challenge that the church is under in the day we're living in?
Yeah, unfortunately, and like I said, I won't name any names, but in the evangelical circle, there is this more left of center thinking, and some of them are self-identified, as the elite, so to speak, within the Christian circles, and kind of the ones who give speeches, the ones who, go to conferences and whatnot. And they kind of look down their nose at the average person, the average individual who is writing from a more conservative perspective, or at least taking the biblical text seriously, which I do. And so originally I had, 2 or 3 publishers that were, expressing some interest in what I was doing. Of course, had not read anything from the manuscript, because it was a work in progress. What I found is that when I showed them kind of the outline and what I was doing and the direction I wanted to go, the response was I remember from one particular publisher, yeah, we don't do the us versus them. And I'm thinking, not exactly sure what you're meaning, who's the them, but the fact that, you are dealing with a Christian value versus a world value. So it is an us versus them in that regard. Some are argued, well, it's too political. Well, what I've been finding that in my latest 2 books that I've been, the most recent books that I published, is that there is a political aspect to this, in the sense of, culturally, we are being influenced by politics, and it's affecting our churches as well. One other publisher, when I was dealing, pointing out in the mandates kind of the process of what's going to happen, and I'm not a prophet, I'm not trying to be, prophetic or anything, but I'm saying, if we continue to reject the Genesis mandates and go on the road that we're on, the next thing that's going to be accepted are things like pedophilia, bestiality. These are going to be, the next fences that are knocked down. And they just thought that was a bridge too far. Don't go there. Don't talk about those things. That's not what's going to happen. And sure enough, it's been 4 or 5 years since I wrote this particular book. That's exactly what's happening.
Yes.
We are dealing with everything that those publishers, fear mongering, it's too controversial, all that. They're more than happy to publish the things that are what we call more woke in their perspective. But anything challenging that, yeah, they don't want to get into that. They don't want to rock the boat. And I'm called to teach the word, and my research has been moving me in that direction.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, well, that's one thing. It was refreshingly incisive. And the political aspect of it, we should just cover this. Your book is not partisan. What it does is it touches on the consequences of public policy by politicians, and how that impacts the family, and what it does, and how the political realm undermines the Genesis mandates. So it was not partisan at all. I didn't read it that way. I didn't read it like, you were pro-Republican or something like that. That's a misunderstanding, I think. If we're going to talk about the Genesis mandates, they apply to all people at all times.
Exactly.
You have to talk about how government intersects with that. Otherwise, you're just putting your head in the sand, it seems to me. Right? I mean, comment on that a little, if you like. Yeah.
I think for too long, the church has, set its politics on one side, and, their Christian life on the other side, and never the twain do meet.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think we're coming to a point where, those individuals we put in power do represent, to a certain degree, need to represent our ideals. And we're seeing that, especially in the United States and Canada, how kind of that left of center thinking all the time has really shaped a lot of our laws that are affecting our families, the education system. All of this is intertwined. And it's time for Christians, and it's time for pastors and grandparents to get involved in that, kind of the direction that I was heading on, kind of, so what do we do? But yeah, you can't get around the political aspect of it. Case in point, when I wrote the book, I made the comment, what would happen if Roe v. Wade was overturned? And I really could not foresee this actually happening.
Yes.
But when you go back and look at what happened, in the past 8 years and kind of the changing of the Supreme Court, things make sense. And so when you say, when you look at it, our political movement or our politics has consequences, especially for something like the Supreme Court, because it literally changed our decisions and the rulings on Roe v. Wade. And that's a fundamental part of the Genesis mandates that I deal with.
Yeah, it's very good. So, Brian, if you could, we got about a minute left in this segment. So could you just bullet point what the Genesis mandates are? We actually haven't laid that out. And then we'll begin sort of unpacking that. So if you could just, name what they are and how they're foundational for all humanity. Go ahead and do that.
Yeah, in Genesis 1 and 2, God establishes the rules for societies. It doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or non-Jewish. And in that those creation mandates, you have something like, you have the species distinctions, and this is kind of in order, the species distinctions and the fact that God ultimately creates humanity to have rule over species and over the world. Then he does the gender distinctions, male and female, both for animals and for humans. Then he mandates procreation for the animals, and for humans at the end of chapter 1, he says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But chapter 2 is the framework, the last mandate for that, and that is the mandate of marriage. And so chapter 2, we're all familiar with chapter 2, verse 24, for this reason, a man shall leave his mom and dad and cling to his wife, and is quoted at a lot of weddings. This is the mandate of marriage. Marriage is the foundation of the family. The family is the foundation of society. And from that, all else branches out. So
excellent. Well, we're going to continue to explore that in our next segment, and then, of course, into part 2 of our interview with Dr. Brian Peterson, and we'll be right back.
Bible in Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible in Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Digging for Truth is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV, positively different television.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. My name is Henry Smith, and I'm here with Dr. Brian Peterson. We are exploring his book, The Bible, Sexuality, and Culture. Now, folks, you can see here that I have lots of sticky notes in Brian's book. And the reason for that is because the book is so good. There were so many things that I found in it that I wanted to highlight so I would remember. So we want to encourage you to pick up a copy of this on the ABR website. Okay, Brian, now, you wanted to add a thought of one more mandate that you didn't explore as much as you would have liked in the book. So tell us about that. And then I want to talk about the fall of Adam and Eve and how critical that is to understanding what's happened in terms of the attack on the Genesis mandates. So go ahead with that.
Right. Yeah, and as I've been teaching this at different classes, what I've found is that next mandate that really is being attacked is the whole concept of work. Work is not necessarily a bad thing. It's mandated by God for Adam and Eve to work in the garden and to keep and tend it. But our culture is rejecting even the concept of work. COVID was a good case in point where people didn't want to go into work. And I could understand, early on, but people now don't want to go back to work. They want to, they reject that concept, but work is where we find, value as well. So that's, if I ever rewrite the book, that is one that I'd want to flesh out a bit. But that brings us to the fall and the concept of the fall. And as this relates to the Genesis mandates, what you get is, God established these mandates, but the fall has corrupted them. And I recognize especially when it comes to our sexuality. The fall, did a number on this for humanity.
Yes.
I just look at something like intersexuality, the intersex issue, where because of the fall, we have these genetic issues now that's created a problem for sexuality. But what the enemy did, and why Genesis 3 is so important, is the enemy did not attack the Genesis mandates in the order that they were given, like species distinctions and whatnot. He actually attacks them in reverse order. So he goes and he takes the one that was the easiest to attack, and that is marriage and the family. Because already there is in the fall, there is a animosity that's developed between the man and the woman, enmity, you could argue. The whole issue of who's going to control whom. And so because of that, the enemy attacked or used because of the fall, that kind of the wedge that was already placed in the relationship. And he began to attack the family and kind of deconstruct the family. And it kind of worked backwards from there. And so, from family to the rejection of children, to the rejection of gender, to the rejection of the species, the species distinction. And we've worked back, in our society is working backwards through those. And there's nothing left when you get to that last one, when humans now become on par with the species and Earth is more important than humanity.
Yeah, that's very good. Brian, too, the other thing that I had never thought about before, the thread that you trace out about human sexuality, it was interesting. I had a friend of mine send me a text message about a new Christian who was reading Genesis and struggling with all this sexual sin that's in there. What is this all about? Why is this going on? Now I was explaining, God is not endorsing this. He's recording what happened. Okay, but you trace the thread out, women against women, men against women, women against men. Talk about that a little bit, because I had never thought about that before.
Yeah, that actually came out of an article I wrote a few years ago. I was asked to deal with sexuality in the Bible. I'm like, well, that's too broad. Let's just look at the first book and see what it says. And really, it took me by surprise as well. I didn't realize how much the book of Genesis had to tell us and teach us about the brokenness of our sexuality. And so what I did is I began to trace, and this was kind of in the height of the Me Too movement, where you had, the problem with the world is, masculinity, toxic masculinity, and men are evil and whatnot. And look, I have no problem as a man, owning up to the fact that there are issues. There's no question, in how we've used sexuality. But I go back to the book of Genesis, and what I find is that it's not just the men who are having problems with the sexual ethics, so to speak, but it's the women as well. And what is that? What it's teaching us is that we're all broken. So I give some examples. I said some of the most heinous acts, sexual acts, barring what's going on at Sodom and Gomorrah, for example, which was bad enough. But when you look at what Sarah does to Hagar, makes her nothing more than a womb to bear children. What Leah and Rachel do to their handmaids, Bill and Zilpah, following in that line. What Lot's daughters do to him in getting him drunk and raping him. What Tamar does to her father-in-law Judah, playing the prostitute. What Potiphar's wife does to, and I think this is telling, especially in our modern culture, where you have someone in a position of power using that to, try to get, sexual satisfaction from somebody. In this case, Joseph, sexual gratification, and
Yes.
he rejects it. So here was a woman in a position of power using it to try to manipulate. And what I found is that the book of Genesis, while it is foundational to understanding of the origins of humanity, it also teaches us about the dangers of a broken sexual ethic and how that can affect every aspect. And it's all family, right? When you look at this, family and the dysfunction that goes on within the families, the patriarchs and the matriarchs, and then even in the workplace for Joseph.
Yeah, excellent. And Joseph ended up going to prison as a result of this monstrously evil accusation against him. Well, Brian, believe it or not, we are at the end of our first episode already, so we're just getting started. So we'll be back for part 2. Appreciate what you've sketched out so far, and we'll continue our conversation. And friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. I've been here with Brian Peterson. We're talking about the attack on the family and the Genesis mandates, and particularly the problem of human sexuality as the thread runs through the book of Genesis. The brokenness. I just want to remind you, though, that when you read through those narratives, remember that this is one of the many reasons that Jesus came into the world, is to heal this kind of brokenness, this perverse, upside down, destructive brokenness in our sexuality. And that is one of the many reasons why Jesus gave his life for us. So please return for part 2 with Dr. Brian Peterson. Thanks for joining us today.